I don't know about you, but every year after Christmas is finished, and by the way, we're not quite finished with Christmas yet in the church year. It goes on for a few more days, but every year after the Christmas day is over, there's a little bit of disappointment within me. And so, in light of that, I wrote the following that appeared on Facebook. I said, "The days after Christmas are, for some people, days to deal with disappointment. The day we planned for so long is now over. The presents, well, some of them weren't quite what we wanted or probably what we needed. The family, it's still the family." The other day I was, and I'm again quoting myself off of Facebook, the other day I listened to a sermon that suggested that disappointment is what comes with the things of the world. The remedy in this sermon was, of course, to make Jesus Christ your personal Lord and Savior, and then you wouldn't be disappointed. Well, I appreciated the realization that the latest Apple product really isn't all that it's cracked up to be, and eventually you'll want something different. But let's face it, disappointment is a very real part of life. Religious formulas disappoint. And even if we're honest, as the Psalms are honest, God disappoints. There's no avoiding disappointment. Folks, disappointment is a regular companion in this journey we call life. And I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that the last 2 years have been as we've dealt with the pandemic, have been full of great disappointment for me. And I have to say, especially recently, as we thought we were turning the corner, thought we were finished with it, and we're not finished with it. Disappointment abounds, even and in particular in the most wonderful time of the year, Christmas. I couldn't help but think of that realization as I struggled with our first reading from Jeremiah today. Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet. He's not particularly happy or joyful. Much of what he says is depressing, but in a small portion of the book, Jeremiah 30 to 33, we experience an upside to him. Well, today's reading comes from that upside, what scholars call the book of consolation. The invitation today from Jeremiah is to sing and rejoice and party because God's people are coming home. The reference is to the return of the Jewish exiles from other lands, sent there by the Assyrians a couple hundred years prior to Jeremiah's time, and by the Babylonians just a few years prior to the writing of Jeremiah. God's people had been scattered, and Jeremiah is expecting and anticipating their return. Jeremiah is obviously concerned with what I would call the lost people of his nation's history. Because frankly, those Assyrian exiles, they are long gone. Their descendants have long ago settled into new lands and created new lives for themselves. But Jeremiah, he hasn't forgotten them. And I understand him, I really do. I really frequently long for all the people of my short history on earth to be gathered together again. And I have to say, the older I get, the deeper that longing becomes. Frankly, that longing is a part of the appeal of something like Facebook. You know, the boy who beat you in the second grade ping pong tournament, or the girl who sat next to you and wrote a long story like you wrote in Mrs. Briggs' class, can once again become a part of your life. They can be gathered together again. The ravages of history and the passage of time can at least temporarily be eliminated. Well, that's Jeremiah's dream. But I must tell you something, for the most part, his dream didn't happen. The exiles weren't brought from the land of the north, as he says today, and from the farthest parts of the earth. A few of them came home, especially after the Babylonian captivity. But you'll find if you read the Bible that many of them who came home were deeply disappointed by what they experienced when they got home. I find it so intriguing that the Bible seems free to include in its pages promises that are not fulfilled. You think maybe the people would, let's leave this out because people are going to say this promise wasn't fulfilled, and that's going to prove that this God thing isn't really real. Now, I have to tell you, there were writers who worked really hard to make the promises appear to be fulfilled. But for some reason, the Bible doesn't seem so preoccupied with itself or its reputation that it isn't willing to lay bare unfulfilled promises. Now, yes, you may say many of the promises propel us forward, and there's no doubt about that. When you hear a new day is coming, a new dawn will emerge, that helps us go into the future with some degree of courage. And I am convinced, by the way, that life without promise, and this is happening to a lot of our young people these days, life without promise becomes a dull, uninspiring life lived on a couch someplace, where without promise there's very little that propels people forward. But still, we must admit, many of the promises aren't kept. Many promises don't deliver. Jeremiah's promise that the exiles, including the vulnerable and those about to give birth, will be gathered together, and that all nations will rejoice with Israel when this occurs, didn't deliver. It didn't happen. In fact, the history of Judaism is replete, full, with even more scattering. And if that wasn't bad enough, the world got to experience the Nazis, who did their best to eliminate the scattered, not allow them to come back home. History is filled with the experience of deep disappointment. We, like the Bible, need to be bold enough to embrace the disappointment. You know, as I look back at my own parenting, I sense that when I made some of my biggest mistakes, it had to do with protecting my boys from disappointment. I hated it when they were disappointed. Tell Micah the story about when he needed to have gloves. He had to have these gloves from the bike shop. Had to have them. And I didn't want to spend the money that he wanted me to spend them. But I run him to the bike shop because I don't want him to be disappointed. And I bought the Dad-Burn gloves, which didn't last very long. Creates a great story, by the way. We talk about it all the time at home, and he laughs at himself, which I think is quite helpful. But I think one of my biggest character flaws is that I try to protect people from disappointment. I spend an enormous amount of time and energy trying to eliminate disappointment. But life stinks sometimes. It's disappointing. People are disappointing. You can't live in a family or in this culture and not experience that. And what's more, as I wrote in my Facebook post, if we're honest, we'll admit that even God disappoints. And some of the psalm writers said that repeatedly. And the role of faith, you see, is not, however, to protect you from disappointment, which is what I sense the pastor whose sermon I mentioned in the Facebook post seemed to be saying. Take Jesus into your heart and you won't be disappointed. Well, first, let me offer a little critique of that. This idea of taking Jesus into your personal heart is an Americanized version of Christianity. It's not biblical Christianity. But secondly, and I can't tell you how many people I know who have taken Jesus into their hearts, who flee from church to church because they need to find a new place to take Jesus into their hearts, because the old place and the old experiences were disappointing. The role of faith is not to protect you from disappointment. Actually, it gives you permission to face disappointment, to tell the truth about it. Actually, I think faith is an invitation to go deeper into disappointment. I must admit to you that during the past 20 or 30 years of my life, those years have driven me to a willingness to admit the disappointing character of all of my formulations of what life is and what it should be. My strongly held opinions, time after time, have proven to me to be disappointing. And sometimes those formulations and opinions have been really important to me. I've built much of my life around them. But those opinions, those formulations also disappoint. They're not adequate. Faith has taken me deeper into that disappointment in order to allow me to be discovered by something that is bigger than my opinions, something that is eternal. And that something eternal doesn't eliminate disappointment, but cradles it in something which doesn't rise or fall on the basis of the latest formulations, opinions, or, especially important in this culture, products. The Gospel of John gives us great insight into the role that faith plays in our disappointment, it seems to me. Today, as I indicated in the children's sermon, he says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word became flesh, that which is beyond all of our formulations, beyond all of the latest products, that which brought life to life, entered real life. The Word became flesh and dwelt in life as it really is. Now, I have to tell you that John is honest enough to name his own disappointment, life as he really knew it. He says that he, and that's a reference to the Christ, was in the world came into being through him, but the world disappointed. The people of the world didn't know him. Even his own people, John says, did not accept him. People can be phenomenally disappointing, but still, the Word became flesh, became one of our own, became bone of our bones. The Word set up its tent in the campground of our disappointments. Here is the promise of faith. Not that life isn't disappointing, not that people aren't disappointing, not that religion or religious formulations aren't disappointing. Rather, the promise of faith is that life, real life, disappointing life, is life that is accompanied, permeated by the power that can create life and bring life out of death. Jesus' life and story always bore witness to that promise. And yes, his life disappointed many. Why else do you think they put him to death? His life as a threat to power to some and as a clear failure to others was deeply disappointing to those around him. And the cross was where the disappointment took him. But faith that is willing to go deeper into disappointment tells us that there's something else going on there. Something that has to do with life, with the life of life itself. John says that the cross of Jesus was a matter of God loving the entire world. Hidden in the disappointment, called the cross, is love. Love that creates life. Love that redeems life, makes it what it should be. Love that sustains life. Love that keeps life going. The cross, experienced through the eyes of faith, is love heaped upon love, grace heaped upon grace. Yes, disappointment is very real. Yet disappointment doesn't have to lead to disillusionment or its close relative, cynicism. I am convinced that one of the biggest challenges of our time is cynicism. Many people these days seem cynical about everything. Cynical about science, cynical about the experts, cynical about government, cynical about the church, cynical about anything that seems true and lasting. Yes, disappointment is real. Yes, so too is the love of God that in Jesus that did not stay at a distance from our disappointing lives, but entered them fully, became flesh and dwelt among us, which imbued them, filled them with eternal meaning. And for me, that signifies that we are free to live with courage and hopefulness, even in the midst of disappointment. We can admit our disappointments, and they also can be put in their place. They don't have to make us crabby, bitter, or cynical. Our disappointments are not the final word. Once again, love wins. Amen.